My grandfather left me his legacy, a town carved from the Alaskan wilderness, but his final letter wasn't about inheritance. It contained 5 rules, written in what I now know was his own blood. I thought they were the ramblings of a dying man. I was wrong. He wasn't protecting a town, he was guarding a cage, and he just handed me the key. The final approach to solitude's point is a gut-wrenching lesson in insignificance. The world as you know it peels away, layer by layer. First the cities, then the highways, then the paved roads, until all that's left is a tiny airstrip in Fairbanks, where you trade a commercial airliner for a de Havilland Beaver, a flying tin can that feels older than the mountains it's meant to cross. My pilot, a man whose face was a roadmap of frostbite scars and squint lines, hadn't said more than 10 words to me in 2 hours. There was nothing to say. Below us, the landscape had spoken for him. It was a vast, silent expanse of white and dark green, a brutal tapestry of snow-laden pines and jagged, unforgiving peaks. It was the kind of beauty that doesn't care if you see it or not. The kind of beauty that could swallow you whole and never notice you were gone. When we finally descended, the plane's skis scraping against the surface of a frozen lake with a sound like tearing fabric, the silence was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't just quiet, it was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that muffled the world, pressing in from all sides. I stepped out of the plane and my breath plumed in a thick white cloud, the only thing moving in the frigid air. Across the lake, nestled against a dark wall of ancient forest, was Solitude's Point. It was exactly as the old photos had shown. No more than a dozen log cabins, a larger building I assumed was the general store, and thin tendrils of grey smoke climbing hesitantly into a pearl-grey sky. It looked less like a town and more like a temporary truce with the wilderness. The pilot grunted as he unloaded my single duffel bag. "Elias is waiting for you. General store." He pointed with his chin towards the largest building. "He'll get you settled." He didn't offer to help, nor did I expect him to. He was already preparing for takeoff, eager to escape the gravity of this place. I watched as the Beaver sputtered back to life, turned and raced across the ice, lifting into the air and leaving me utterly, profoundly alone. The drone of its engine faded, and the immense silence rushed back in, filling the void. My grandfather founded this place. The thought felt absurd as I stood there, a solitary figure in a world of white. What kind of man looks at all this emptiness and thinks, "Yes, this is where I'll build a home"? My walk to the store was surreal. My boots were the only sound, a rhythmic crunching in the packed snow. No cars, no distant sirens, no human voices, just the squeak of my footsteps and the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of the wind through the pines. The town felt preserved, like an exhibit in a museum of isolation. The general store was warmer than I could have imagined. A pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated a comforting heat that smelled of wood smoke and coffee. A man stood behind the counter, polishing a glass lantern. He looked up as the bell above the door chimed, and I knew instantly it was Elias. He was exactly as my grandfather had described him, tall and gaunt, with a face that seemed to be carved from the same ancient wood as the cabins. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. They were the eyes of a man who had stared into a long, dark night and had never quite looked away. You must be Liam," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. "That's me." "And you're Elias." I extended a hand. He took it, his grip surprisingly strong, calloused and dry. "Thanks for meeting me. It's what we do," he said, his expression unchanging. "Your grandfather was a great man, tough as a winter-starved wolf. This town owes him everything." He paused, his gaze drifting past me, out the window and into the encroaching twilight. "And it cost him everything." The words hung in the warm air, a strange and somber note. Before I could ask what he meant, he moved from behind the counter. "Come on. I'll take you to his cabin. It's yours now, everything in it." The cabin was on the edge of town, the last bastion of civilization before the forest took over completely. It was larger than the others, built with a sense of permanence and pride. The logs were thick as my torso, the stonework of the chimney precise and solid. It was a fortress. Inside, it was just as my grandfather had left it. A bookshelf filled with worn paperbacks, a sturdy oak table, a deep leather armchair positioned before a massive stone fireplace. It smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and something else. Something clean and cold, like the air after a lightning strike. The generator provides power for a few hours each night, from 6 till 10, Elias explained, his tone purely informational. Water comes from the well out back. You'll need to break the ice each morning. The pantry is stocked. We get a supply plane once a month, weather permitting. Any questions so far? Seems straightforward enough, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The sheer reality of living here was beginning to set in. I appreciate you showing me the ropes. The ropes, Elias repeated, the words tasting strange in his mouth. He stared at me, his pale eyes seeming to weigh my worth. There's one more thing, the most important thing. He reached into the inner pocket of his thick flannel jacket and pulled out a small rectangular object. It was a card, maybe the size of a driver's license, that had been laminated in plastic, the edges yellowed and frayed with age. He held it out to me not casually, but with a strange sort of ritualistic gravity, like a priest offering a sacrament. "Your grandfather wrote these," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He gave a copy to every person who lives here. This was his original. He wanted you to have it." I took it from him. The card was stiff, and I could feel the texture of the paper beneath the plastic. There were 5 rules, written in my grandfather's familiar spidery cursive. I read the first one, and a small laugh escaped my lips. Is this some kind of rookie hazing ritual? A local tradition to scare the new guy? Elias's face remained a stone mask. There was no flicker of humor, no hint of a joke. "No," he said, the word flat and heavy. "There are no jokes in Solitude's Point, not after the sun goes down." His seriousness was unnerving. It was so absolute, so devoid of any irony, that it extinguished my own amusement. I looked back down at the card, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. This time, I read them all. 1. After midnight, if you hear whistling from outside, no matter how familiar the tune, lock your windows and do not look. My initial thought was of some local ghost story, the kind of spooky tale every small town has. It was creepy, sure, but easy enough to dismiss. 2. Never let the fire in the hearth go out completely during the night. The smoke keeps the cold away. This one seemed almost practical. A metaphor, perhaps. Keep the fire going for warmth, obviously. The capitalization of cold was strange, but I brushed it off as my grandfather's penchant for the dramatic. 3. If the lights begin to flicker and you smell ozone, like the air before a thunderstorm, remain absolutely silent for 5 full minutes. It hunts by sound. Okay, this was where it started to feel less like a folksy tradition and more like genuine paranoia. The details were too specific. Ozone, hunting by sound. The hair on my arms began to prickle. 4. Ignore any knock at your door that comes in a rhythm of 3. Your family and friends know to knock twice. A secret knock. It felt childish, something out of a spy novel for kids. Yet, coupled with the previous rules, it created a narrative that was starting to feel deeply unsettling. It implied a threat that was not only real, but intelligent. A threat that could try to trick you. 5. Most importantly, if you hear the voice of a loved one calling for help from outside, do not open the door. The cold learns. I read the last rule twice. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, washed over me. This was different. This was personal. This was psychological. It conjured a horrific image. The sound of my sister or my mother, their voices filled with panic, begging me to let them in from the freezing dark. And I would have to stand there listening and do nothing. Who would invent such a cruel rule? For what possible purpose? The capitalization was there again. The cold. Not just a temperature, but a name. "Elias?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What is this? What does it mean?" He shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the card in my hand. "It means you follow them. To the letter. No questions. You don't test them. You don't try to understand them, you just obey. Your grandfather wrote these rules to keep us safe. He wrote them with wisdom earned through loss. He finally looked at me, his eyes boring into mine. Everyone who is still here because of these rules. Remember that. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the heavy iron latch. Welcome to Solitude's Point, Liam. The generator will shut off at 10. Make sure your fire is well stoked before then. He gave me one last lingering look. The night is long here. Don't make it any longer than it has to be. And then he was gone. I stood in the center of the cabin, the laminated card feeling heavy and dangerous in my hand. The silence he left behind was different. It was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. The cabin, which had felt like a warm, welcoming inheritance just minutes before, now felt like a cage. A shelter, yes, but also the last line of defense against something that had a name. As the sun bled out below the horizon, plunging the world into an ocean of deep indigo, I walked over to the massive stone fireplace. I knelt down and began to stack logs onto the glowing embers Elias had left, my movements slow and deliberate. I told myself I was just doing it for the warmth. It was a lie. I was following rule number 2. With the fire crackling, casting flickering shadows across the room, I sat down in my grandfather's worn leather armchair. I placed the list of rules on the small table beside me. It lay there, face up, a venomous little testament to a reality I couldn't yet accept. Outside there was nothing but the impenetrable blackness of the Alaskan wilderness and a silence that seemed to be listening. My first night in Solitude's Point was just beginning, and I still clung to the desperate hope that it was all some elaborate, twisted welcome prank. I had no idea that pranks don't survive the winter here. They freeze and shatter, just like everything else. If you want to find out what happened next, what horrors that first night held, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Trust me, you'll want some company to help you get through the night. The heavy thud of the cabin door closing behind Elias echoed in the sudden emptiness. It was a sound of finality, the sealing of a tomb. For a long time, I just stood there, the silence pressing in, my grandfather's laminated card clutched in my hand. The warmth from the fireplace was a small, defiant island in an ocean of encroaching cold. At 10 o'clock, exactly as Elias had predicted, the generator sputtered and died. The single bare bulb in the ceiling flickered once, twice, and then plunged the cabin into a profound primeval darkness, broken only by the frantic dancing light of the flames in the hearth. The transition was jarring. One moment the cabin was a place of humming, modern utility. The next it was a relic from another century. The hum I hadn't even noticed was now a cavernous absence, and every small sound was amplified. The hiss and pop of the burning logs, the groan of ancient wood settling, the low moan of the wind as it scraped against the eaves. I spent the next 2 hours in a state of heightened, anxious awareness, doing my best to rationalize away the gnawing unease. The rules, I told myself, were a psychological remnant of a harsher time, a way for the first settlers, including my grandfather, to cope with the immense mind-breaking isolation of this place. The whistling, the wind moving through a uniquely shaped canyon or a hollow tree, the flickering lights and the smell of ozone, a faulty generator, a common issue in remote locations, the knocking, a traveler lost in the woods, the voice of a loved one, a hallucination brought on by stress and solitude. Every rule had a logical, scientific explanation if you were willing to look for it. I was a man of the 21st century. I believed in physics and psychology, not in folklore written on a yellowed card. And yet, I kept the fire well fed. Just before midnight, I finally succumbed to exhaustion, my body heavy with the fatigue of travel and my mind weary from its own circular arguments. I didn't get into the bed in the small adjacent room. The thought of being in another room, separated from the fire and the main door, felt inexplicably wrong. I settled into the deep leather armchair, my grandfather's chair, and pulled a thick wool blanket over myself. The firelight painted the walls in shifting shades of orange and black, and the rhythmic crackling of the logs was a hypnotic, comforting lullaby. My last conscious thought was that Elias and his superstitions had gotten to me. Then I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. I was ripped from it by a sound. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent. It was something far more insidious. It was a melody, whistled, cutting through the sound of the wind with an impossible clarity. It was faint at first, a thin silver thread of sound weaving through the darkness outside. I sat bolt upright, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs. My first thought was that I was dreaming it, a figment of my anxiety-soaked subconscious. But as I held my breath, straining my ears against the silence of the cabin, it came again, clearer this time. A simple 8-note tune, and a cold, liquid terror filled my veins, because I knew the tune. It was the lullaby my mother used to sing to me when I had nightmares as a child. A song I hadn't heard in 20 years, a song no one in this frozen wasteland could possibly know. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carried on the frigid air. It was a perfect, note-for-note rendition, complete with the slight off-key waver she always made on the 5th note. The sheer intimacy of it was a violation. It was a key turning in a lock deep inside my soul. Rule number 1 slammed into the forefront of my mind. No matter how familiar the tune, lock your windows and do not look. My body was frozen in the chair, a war raging within me. The rational part of my brain screamed that this was impossible. It had to be a coincidence, a trick of the wind. My tired mind playing games. I had to see. I had to look out the window and see the logical source, a branch, a wire, anything, and put this childish fear to rest. But another deeper instinct, something primal and terrified, screamed back. It was the same instinct that makes an animal freeze in the path of a predator it cannot see. It was the memory of Elias's dead serious eyes. The whistle came again, closer this time, as if the whistler were standing just beyond the tree line. It was patient. It was questioning. It felt curious. With a surge of adrenaline that made my hands shake, I forced myself out of the chair. I didn't run to the window. I scrambled away from it. The cabin had 2 windows in the main room, their glass panes like black, unblinking eyes. I checked the lock on the first one, a heavy iron bolt. It was already secure. I moved to the second, my back screaming with the feeling of being watched, and slid its bolt home with a loud metallic clack. The sound seemed to fill the world. Outside, the whistling stopped. The silence that followed was 1,000 times worse than the sound it replaced. It was a loaded, listening silence. I stood there trembling in the center of the room, my gaze darting between the 2 black squares of the windows. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. I retreated to the fireplace, adding more logs with shaking hands, mesmerized by the solid, honest reality of the flames. I did not sleep again. For hours I sat there, listening, but the whistling did not return. The sun that morning was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, its pale, watery light spilling over the mountains and bringing the world back from the dead. In the light of day, fear felt like a foolish indulgence. The cabin was just a cabin. The woods were just woods. The whistling. My mind, overtired and suggestible, had played a trick on me. That had to be the answer. Determined to prove it, to find a rational explanation and reclaim my sanity, I pulled on my heaviest coat and walked into town. Solitude's Point was marginally more alive by day. I saw a few figures moving between cabins, their heads down, their movements economical and purposeful. No one loitered. No one made eye contact. The general store was the town's nucleus, and I found Elias there again, along with 2 other men who were sipping coffee by the stove. They were older, their faces as weathered as Elias's, and they fell silent the moment I walked in. The air thickened with unspoken words. "Morning," I said, trying for a casual tone. "Slept like a log. This mountain air really knocks you out." Elias just nodded, his eyes giving nothing away. The other 2 men mumbled greetings into their mugs. "Strange acoustics out here," I continued, pushing my luck. "Last night I could have sworn I heard someone whistling. Sounded like it was right outside my window." The effect was instantaneous and profound. One of the men, a burly figure with a thick grey beard, abruptly stood up, set his mug down with a clatter, and walked out without a word. The other man became intensely interested in the floorboards. Elias's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. "The wind plays tricks," Elias said, his voice level. "This place, it gets in your head if you let it." It was a dismissal, but it was also a confirmation. It was the practiced, carefully worded response of a man who has had this conversation before. They knew, they all knew. They were living inside this silent, shared nightmare, and they had no intention of letting me in. I was the outsider, the variable, the one who might break the rules they all clung to for survival. I left the store feeling colder than when I had entered. The paranoia was no longer just a seed. It was a sprouting, thorny vine, wrapping itself around my thoughts. The rest of the day was spent in a blur of anxious activity. I chopped wood. I organized my grandfather's books. I did anything to keep my mind and body occupied. But as the sun began its descent once more, a familiar dread began to creep back into the cabin. The second night was not going to be like the first. I was no longer a skeptic. I was a believer. I made my preparations with a grim sense of ritual. The fire was built up into a roaring blaze long before the generator cut out. I double-checked the window bolts. I ate a cold meal from a can, my appetite gone. When the darkness fell, I was ready for it, sitting in the armchair, the laminated card in my lap. I was prepared for the whistling. I was prepared for strange smells. I was not prepared for the knock. It came around 1 in the morning. A sharp, commanding sound against the thick wood of the front door. Tock, tock, tock. 3 distinct, evenly spaced knocks. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the frantic rapping of someone in distress. It was measured, deliberate. It was a summons. Rule number 4 screamed in my mind. Ignore any knock at your door that comes in a rhythm of 3. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My eyes were glued to the door, a solid barrier of oak that suddenly felt as thin as paper. Who was out there? What was out there in the absolute freezing darkness? The fire crackled, the only sound in the world. Then it came again, louder this time, more insistent. Tock, tock, tock. The sound vibrated through the floorboards. It was real. It was there. A part of my mind, the part that still clung to the world I used to know, wanted to yell out, to ask who was there. But the fear was absolute. I was a mouse, frozen, aware of the hawk circling overhead. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on the rule. Ignore it. Another minute passed in agonizing silence. I began to think, to hope, that whatever it was had gone away. Then a new sound, a soft, dry scratching against the wood, like a finger tracing patterns on the door. It went on for what felt like an eternity before it too stopped. I remained in that chair all night, a sentinel guarding a fortress that had already been breached. My skepticism was dead and buried. The whistling, the silent conspiracy of the townsfolk, the knocks, it was all real. These weren't rules my grandfather had written to cope with loneliness. They were a manual for surviving a siege. And as I sat there, staring at the door, a terrifying realization dawned on me. This thing, this cold, it wasn't just some mindless force of nature. It was intelligent, it was patient, and it was testing me, one rule at a time. The dawn of the third day brought with it no comfort, only clarity. My skepticism had been stripped away, layer by painful layer, leaving behind the raw exposed nerve of belief. The whistling had been a chilling suggestion, the knocking had been a direct threat. I was no longer a grandson visiting an inherited property. I was a soldier in a trench, staring out into a no-man's land I couldn't comprehend, armed only with a cryptic list of orders. Survival was no longer enough. I needed to understand the nature of the war I was fighting. I needed answers, and I knew there was only one place to find them, buried in the life my grandfather had left behind. I spent the daylight hours not in frantic, busy work, but in a methodical, almost archaeological excavation of the cabin. I wasn't just looking for supplies or keepsakes, I was searching for a testament. I ran my hands over every floorboard, tapped on every wall, explored the dark corners of every cupboard. It was behind a loose stone in the fireplace hearth that I found it. The stone pulled away to reveal a small dark cavity, just large enough to hold a metal box, cold to the touch. It was an old military-style ammunition can, painted black, its latch stiff with disuse. Inside, nestled in a bed of what looked like dried herbs and salt, were 4 leather-bound journals. My grandfather's handwriting, the same spidery cursive from the laminated card, covered every page. This was it, the source code of Solitude's Point. I took the journals to the heavy oak table, the afternoon sun providing a temporary false sense of security. and I began to read. The first journal was filled with a rugged, pioneering optimism. The entries, dated over 50 years ago, spoke of freedom, of building a sanctuary away from the noise and clutter of the modern world. He wrote of the clean air, the magnificent, silent beauty of the landscape, and the satisfaction of building a life with his own 2 hands. He wrote of my grandmother, Sarah, her laughter echoing in the vast emptiness, her strength a match for his own. They were creating a legacy, a small pocket of defiant life, in the face of an indifferent wilderness. October 17th. The first snows have come. There is a purity to this place that cleanses the soul. Sarah says the silence is so loud it hums. We are not conquering this land. We are being accepted by it. We are home. The tone began to shift, subtly at first. Near the end of the first journal, which chronicled their first winter, the entries became shorter, more functional. The poetic descriptions of the landscape were replaced by notations of temperature, snowfall, and dwindling supplies. A new word appeared, one I had only seen on the laminated card. The cold, December 1st. Another storm is coming, but there is something else in the air. A feeling, a stillness that is not peace. The cold is different this year, deeper. It feels watchful. The second journal was where the optimism died completely. It began with the arrival of 3 other families, friends from their old life, drawn by my grandfather's letters of a northern paradise. Their arrival should have been a joyous occasion, a validation of his dream. Instead, it marked the beginning of the nightmare. The journal entries transformed into a log of strange occurrences, of escalating terror and unbearable loss. January 9th. The Petersons' youngest, a boy named Daniel, disappeared from his bed. We searched for 2 days. No tracks. It was as if he was simply erased from the world. His mother swears she heard him whistling his favorite song from the woods just before they noticed he was gone. We all told her it was just the wind. My blood turned to ice. Rule number 1. It wasn't a warning about a ghost. It was a memorial to a lost child. A lure, a mimicry designed to prey on love and hope. I read on, my hands trembling. January 21st. We have been hearing knocks at night, always in 3s. John Peterson, Daniel's father, maddened with grief, was convinced it was a rescue party. He opened his door to the night. We found him in the morning, 20 feet from his cabin, frozen solid. Not a mark on him, just empty, as if all the warmth, all the life, had been sucked out of him in an instant. Rule number 4. A trap for the desperate. A signal that promised help, but delivered only an empty, frozen death. Each rule, I was realizing, was a tombstone. Each line had been paid for in blood. The journal chronicled a slow, agonizing descent into madness and paranoia as this unseen, intelligent force picked them off, one by one, learning their habits, their hopes, their fears. It learned that they came running to the sound of a child's tune. It learned they opened their doors to a confident knock. It was a predator, and it was studying its prey. The third journal was the hardest to read. The ink was often smudged, the handwriting ragged, as if written by a hand shaking with grief or rage. It detailed the creation of the rules, the desperate, brutal process of trial and error. But it was the final entry in this journal that broke something inside of me. It was about my grandmother, Sarah. February 12th. It took her voice. It took my Sarah's voice. I was outside securing the woodpile before the sun went down, when the blizzard hit, sudden and violent. I barely made it back to the cabin, the world a screaming vortex of white. I was inside for less than a minute when I heard it. Her voice, calling my name from the heart of the storm. "Arthur, I'm lost, I can't see, please open the door." For a second I believed it. My heart seized. But Sarah was inside. She was standing right behind me, her face pale with terror. We stared at each other as the voice outside, her perfect voice, begged and pleaded. It screamed my name, told me it was freezing, that it loved me. It was a perfect, flawless imitation. We held each other in the center of the room, listening to the sound of my wife dying over and over again, just outside our door. The cold was no longer just hunting us. It was toying with us. It was learning not just what we did, but who we loved. That was the night I wrote the last rule, the cruelest one, the most necessary one. I closed the journal, my throat tight. I felt a profound, crushing weight of inherited sorrow. This wasn't just a monster story, this was my family's story. The rules weren't just a list, they were my grandfather's pain, codified into a survival guide. I finally understood the look in Elias's eyes. It was the look of a man who had survived something that had hollowed him out completely. The sun was long gone, and the generator had been humming for hours, but I hadn't noticed. Lost in the past, I had forgotten the present. I switched on a battery-powered lantern, its steady LED glow a small comfort against the encroaching night, and opened the final journal. It was filled with more esoteric observations, theories about what the entity was. An ancient thing, he called it, a hunger given form. That is something that had been sleeping under the ice and rock for millennia, awakened by their arrival. It was as I was reading a particularly chilling passage, it is drawn to strong emotions, grief, despair, love. It feeds on them before it feeds on the flesh. That it happened. The steady beam of my lantern began to pulse. It didn't flicker like a bad connection. It dimmed and brightened in a slow, rhythmic, almost organic way. Thump, 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 like a heartbeat. My own heart leaped into my throat. Simultaneously, a strange, sterile scent filled the cabin. It was sharp and metallic, the smell of burnt air after a lightning strike. Ozone. Rule number 3. If the lights begin to flicker and you smell ozone, remain absolutely silent for 5 full minutes. It hunts by sound. My blood roared in my ears. The words from the journal and the reality of the situation slammed together with the force of a physical blow. The light from the lantern continued its sickening pulse. The smell of ozone grew stronger, so thick I could almost taste it. My every instinct screamed at me to bolt, to run, to yell. But my grandfather's voice, raw with pain from the page, was louder. With a shaking hand, I reached over and switched off the lantern. The cabin was plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. The fire had burned down to a bed of low-glowing embers, casting no discernible light. The darkness was total. It was disorienting, a complete sensory deprivation that forced all my awareness inward, to the frantic drumming of my own heart and the ragged, shallow sound of my own breathing. I held my breath, knowing that even that small noise might be a death sentence. And in that utter silence I heard it. It wasn't a loud sound, it was subtle and all the more terrifying for it. A faint, low-frequency vibration that seemed to come from the very foundations of the cabin. It was accompanied by a soft, dragging scrape against the exterior wall on the far side of the room. It was the sound of something immense and heavy shifting its weight, of a textured surface, like rough stone or thick bark, grazing against the logs. It moved slowly, deliberately circling the cabin. I could track its progress by the faint groans of the wood under its impossible pressure. I stayed frozen in my chair, my muscles screaming with tension. The smell of ozone was overpowering now. A clean, chemical scent of utter wrongness. I began counting the seconds in my head. A desperate, silent mantra. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. The scraping stopped directly outside the wall I was facing. The pressure on the logs intensified. I could hear the wood creaking, complaining, fibers groaning under a silent, colossal weight. It was listening. I knew it with a certainty that transcended logic. It was waiting for me to make a sound. A cough, a whimper, a single terrified gasp. I squeezed my eyes shut, concentrating all my willpower on the simple, impossible task of not existing. The 5 minutes felt like an eternity. It was a lifetime spent in the dark, every second stretched to a breaking point. Then, as slowly as it had begun, the pressure on the wall receded. The faint vibrations faded. The scraping sound started again, moving away from the cabin, growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the night. I waited another full minute, my body refusing to unlock, before I dared to move. I fumbled for the lantern, my fingers clumsy and numb, and switched it on. The steady white light flooded the cabin, chasing the shadows back into the corners. Everything was as it had been. The journals lay on the table. The embers glowed softly in the hearth. But the smell of ozone still lingered in the air, a phantom reminder of the visitation. And the silence outside was no longer empty. It was the silence of a hunter that had moved on, for now. I had survived. I had followed the rule, and I had survived. The terror was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but something else was there now too. A grim, steely resolve. The rules were not folklore. They were the distilled, hard-won wisdom of the dead. They were my inheritance, my weapon, and my only hope. I looked from the journals to the dark windows and back again, and I knew the night was far from over. The cold had tested me, and I had passed, but I had the chilling feeling that the tests were only going to get harder. Surviving the third night did not grant me the relief of victory, but the burden of knowledge. The cold was not just a mindless, hungry force, it was a strategist. It had tested my awareness with the whistling, my resolve with the knocking, and my discipline with the silence. In each instance, I had reacted, followed the rules, and survived. A chilling thought began to take root in the fertile ground of my paranoia. By obeying the rules, I was teaching it what worked and what didn't. I was a lab rat, and my survival was merely data for a predator that was learning, adapting, and refining its methods of attack. The fear I felt now was different. It was no longer the sharp panic of a sudden threat, but the slow, grinding dread of an inevitable, intelligent assault. The days became a hollow imitation of life, a frantic period of preparation for the siege of the night. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. I tried, in the bright, deceptive safety of the morning, to lie down on the bed, but my eyes would snap open at the slightest creak of the cabin. My body was a tightly coiled spring of adrenaline and exhaustion. I existed on a diet of canned beans, stale crackers, and a constant bitter stream of black coffee. My primary activity became the obsessive maintenance of the fireplace. I chopped wood with a feverish intensity, my axe strokes a desperate rhythm against the oppressive silence. I stacked the logs inside, arranging them by size and dryness, a meticulous, nonsensical ritual that gave me the illusion of control. The fire was no longer a source of comfort. It was a vital organ, its steady heartbeat the only thing keeping the cabin from becoming a tomb. The isolation began its insidious work on my mind. I started talking to myself, my whispers a jarring intrusion into the profound quiet. "Check the bolt again, Liam. Did you check it?" I would then answer myself, "Yes, you checked it 5 minutes ago. It's fine." The silence of the townsfolk was a form of psychological torture in itself. When I ventured to the general store for supplies, Elias and the others would look at me with a deep, weary pity in their eyes. They saw the dark circles under my eyes, the tremble in my hands. They recognized the symptoms. They had all been through this crucible, and their survival had been purchased at the cost of some vital part of their humanity. They offered no words of comfort, no shared stories of their own experiences. To speak of the hunter was to draw its attention. Their silence wasn't malice, it was a wall built to protect what little they had left. And so I turned to the only person who would speak to me, my grandfather. His journals became my Bible and my confessor. I would read his words aloud, my voice hoarse in the stillness. "So you think it feeds on emotion, Arthur?" I'd say to the empty room. "Is that why it mimics the ones we love? To generate the strongest vintage?" The cabin became a bubble, a fragile sphere containing my unraveling sanity, floating in a vast, predatory emptiness. It was on the 5th night that the cold changed its tactics. It abandoned the subtle elemental attacks and began to wage a war directly on my mind. It started with whispers, so faint I thought they were the sighing of the wind in the chimney. But they weren't random. They were fragments of my life, echoes stolen from my own memory. I heard the voice of my college roommate, Mark, whispering a line from a movie we'd watched 100 times. "It's in the walls," a private joke between us. Then, the voice of my old boss, a dry, reedy sound muttering a single word, "Deadline." These weren't threats. They were intrusions, intimate and defiling. It was as if the entity was sitting in the dark with me, flipping through the pages of my life, testing the resonance of each memory. It was rifling through my skull, searching for the right key to unlock my fear. I huddled by the fire, the wool blanket pulled up to my ears, trying to block out the insidious whispers that seemed to emanate from the very air around me. I was no longer just a prisoner in this cabin. I was a prisoner in my own head, and the jailer was picking the lock. The cumulative effect of sleeplessness was a slow poison. My perception began to fray at the edges. In the periphery of my vision, shadows would writhe and coalesce into fleeting shapes. The grain of the wooden walls would seem to crawl and shift. The border between the real and the imagined was dissolving, and I was adrift, unable to trust my own senses. I knew this was what it wanted. It wanted to break me down, to erode my sanity until I was too weak, too confused to follow the rules that kept me alive. It was the 7th night, by my shaky count, that I finally made a mistake. I had been awake for what felt like 100 hours. My eyelids were leaden weights, my thoughts a sluggish, syrupy fog. I'd been staring into the flames of the hearth for hours, the dancing light a hypnotic pendulum. I knew I couldn't sleep. I knew it was the most dangerous thing I could do. But my body, pushed beyond its limits, finally betrayed my will. My head lolled to the side, and I slumped into a deep, dreamless abyss of exhaustion. I awoke to a cold so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't the simple, biting cold of the Alaskan air. This was a dead, predatory cold, a presence defined by its utter lack of heat. The fire had died down to a fist-sized cluster of faint, pulsing red embers, their glow pathetic and frail. The air I exhaled didn't just plume. It crystallized, hanging in the air before me like a ghostly veil. A thick, feathery layer of frost was creeping across the interior of the window panes, but it didn't stop there. It was advancing across the floorboards, a lattice of white ice spreading out from the walls, a visible tide of absolute zero. The cabin was being flash-frozen from the outside in, and there was a presence in the room with me. I couldn't see it, I couldn't hear it, but I could feel it. It was a void, a patch of utter stillness in the center of the room that seemed to absorb all sound, all light, all warmth. The very air felt dense and heavy around it, and the pressure in my ears was immense. Rule number 2 blazed in my mind, a frantic, desperate alarm. Never let the fire in the hearth go out completely. The smoke keeps the cold away. Panic, pure and undiluted, gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I scrambled from the chair, my limbs stiff and clumsy, a cry of terror frozen in my throat. Every fiber of my being screamed that to move, to make a sound, was to die. The entity that hunted by sound was one thing. This felt like something else entirely, the source of the cold itself, its physical manifestation. But the alternative, to sit there and let the last ember die, was unthinkable. My fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled for the iron poker leaning against the hearth. It was so cold it felt like it was burning my skin. I jabbed at the embers, trying to break them apart, to expose a new surface to the air. A few weak sparks flew. It wasn't enough. The frost on the floor was now only a few feet away from me. The feeling of the void in the room intensified, a malevolent gravity pulling at me. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the biting cold of the floorboards, and blew on the embers with all the air in my lungs. My breath, which was freezing a foot from my face, hit the coals. For a horrifying second, they seemed to dim even further. I blew again, a desperate, ragged gasp. A tiny, hesitant tongue of orange flame flickered to life. It was as if I had struck a match in a cavern of gunpowder. The void in the room recoiled. I felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere, a silent, violent rejection of the sudden light and heat. The pressure in my ears lessened. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a handful of dry kindling from the wood box, splinters of fat wood and pine shavings I had meticulously prepared, and thrust it onto the fledgling flame. It caught, smoke and the rich scent of pitch pine suddenly filling the air. The smoke was not just smoke. It felt like a shield, a warm aromatic barrier against the sterile, absolute cold. The flames grew, catching the larger logs I had stacked in the hearth. As the fire roared back to life, the frost on the floor began to retreat. It didn't melt. It simply vanished, receding back towards the walls as if being chased away by the advancing light. The oppressive feeling of the presence dissipated, leaving behind only a lingering, bone-deep chill and the metallic tang of pure fear in my mouth. I collapsed backward, away from the life-giving heat of the fire, my body shaking uncontrollably. I had survived. I had broken a rule, or come perilously close to it, and I had seen the consequence. This was the entity stripped of its tricks, its mimicry, its psychological games. This was its true form, a walking, silent, all-consuming winter. I looked at the fire, now a blazing inferno, and I understood. The rules weren't just a list of warnings. They were a series of desperately constructed walls, and I had just let the enemy breach the outermost one. And now it knew I was vulnerable, it knew I was getting tired, and it knew I was alone. The aftermath of my near-fatal mistake with the fire was a transformation. Fear, which had been a constant churning sea in my gut, crystallized into something hard and sharp. A diamond of pure, obsessive vigilance. I was no longer merely a frightened man trying to survive the night. I was a priest, tending a sacred flame, the sole guardian of a fragile pact with the darkness. My days were now governed by a singular, all-consuming purpose, ensuring the hearth would never again fall silent. I became an expert in the alchemy of combustion. I learned the distinct characters of the wood I burned, the slow, steady heat of the oak, the hot, fast blaze of the pine, the long-lasting glow of the birch. My hands, once soft from a life of keyboards and books, were now calloused, split, and perpetually smudged with soot. Sleep became my sworn enemy, a treacherous siren luring me toward the same icy abyss I had so narrowly escaped. I fought it with a grim determination, stationing myself in my grandfather's armchair each night, a poker in one hand and a mug of scalding coffee in the other. I learned to exist in a strange liminal state, a twilight of consciousness where I was neither truly awake nor fully asleep. In this state, my mind became a haunted theater. The whispers returned, no longer just fleeting fragments, but entire phantom conversations replayed from my past. I heard arguments with ex-girlfriends, joyful celebrations with family, mundane chats with friends, each one a perfect, ghostly replica, designed to draw me into a world that no longer existed, to distract me from my vigil. I learned to treat my own memories as a foreign country, a hostile territory I could not afford to visit. For 3 consecutive nights after the incident with the fire, nothing happened. The whistling did not return. There were no knocks at the door. The lights did not flicker. The silence that descended upon the cabin was absolute, and it was the most terrifying tactic the cold had employed yet. The constant direct threats had been exhausting, but they were a known quantity. This new silence was a weapon of psychological attrition. It was the held breath of a predator. It left me alone with the ghosts in my head and the frantic, metronomic beating of my own heart. Every creak of the settling logs, every sigh of the wind was magnified into a potential attack. The waiting was a worse torture than the assault itself, and I felt my sanity stretching thin, like a wire pulled to its breaking point. It was on the 4th night of this oppressive quiet, the 10th night of my ordeal, that the attack I had been dreading finally came. It didn't begin with a whisper or a knock. It began with the jarring, alien sound of technology. The satellite phone my grandfather had left on his desk, a heavy brick-like device I hadn't even thought to check, suddenly shrieked to life. The electronic ring was a violent intrusion, a sound from another universe tearing through the primeval stillness of the cabin. For a moment I was too stunned to move. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. Who could possibly be calling me? No one knew this number. I hadn't given it to a soul. My first thought was Elias, perhaps a warning of some kind. Hesitantly, I rose from the armchair and crossed to the desk. The phone's small screen glowed with an incoming call, but there was no number, only the words, "Unknown signal." With a trembling hand, I pressed the green button. "Hello?" My voice was a dry, unused croak. The line was a storm of static, a hiss and crackle like a radio tuned between stations. Then, through the noise, a voice cut through, faint and desperate. A voice that bypassed every defense I had built, every wall I had erected, and struck me directly in the heart. "Liam? Liam, is that you?" Oh, thank God. It was my sister, Chloe. The world tilted on its axis. My carefully constructed reality, built on fear and vigilance, shattered into a million pieces. It couldn't be, it was impossible. She was 1,000 miles away, safe in her warm apartment. "Chloe?" I choked out the name. "What's going on? Where are you?" I was so worried," her voice came through in broken, static-laced fragments. "You weren't answering. I got the name of the town from..." old letter of Grandpa's. I tried to surprise you. The car, the rental SUV. It's dead, Liam. It just died. I'm on some logging road. I walked. I can see the lights of the town, I think, but I'm so cold. Her voice was perfect. It was her exact timbre, her specific cadence, the little catch of a sob she always got when she was truly terrified. My mind reeled, trying to process the impossible. My love for my sister, my lifelong instinct to protect her, surged through me like a tidal wave, washing away all the rules, all the warnings. She was out there. She was freezing. She needed me. "Stay on the phone, Chloe. I'm coming to get you," I shouted into the receiver, my eyes frantically scanning the cabin. My coat, my boots, the keys to the old snowmobile in the shed. "Hurry, Liam," she sobbed, her words dissolving into the static. "It's so dark, and I keep hearing things moving in the trees." The line went dead. I threw the phone onto the desk. My mind was a maelstrom of panic and purpose. I was halfway to the door, pulling on my heavy winter coat, my only thought to get to her, when a single cold shard of logic pierced through the emotional chaos. I got the name of the town from an old letter of Grandpa's. I froze, my hand on the iron door latch. No, that wasn't possible. In all his letters, my grandfather had been meticulously vague. He referred to his home only as "my sanctuary in the north" or "our little piece of the wild." He never ever wrote down the name Solitude's Point. It was a deliberate omission, a precaution I had never understood until now. I had told my family I was going to Grandpa's cabin in Alaska. I had never spoken the name of the town to anyone. She could not know it. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The hope that had flared so brightly just moments before was extinguished, replaced by a dread so profound it was nauseating. It was a trick. The most sophisticated, the most monstrous, the most cruel trick imaginable. It had found the deepest part of me, the purest love I possessed, and it was turning it into a weapon. My hand fell away from the door latch. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand, and then I heard it. Not from the phone this time, but from outside. A soft, crunching sound in the snow, just beyond the door. Then a small, timid fist hammered against the wood. It was not the confident, rhythmic triple knock from before. It was the frantic, desperate drumming of someone small and terrified. "Liam!" Chloe's voice, not through a speaker, not distorted by static. It was crystal clear, as if she were standing right on the other side of the door. My blood ran cold. "Liam, please, open the door. It's me. I'm right here. I'm so cold I can't feel my fingers." I stumbled backward until my back hit the far wall and slid down to the floor. This was the final test, the culmination of everything. Rule number 5, the one my grandfather had written after listening to his own wife's voice beg him for entry, echoed in the ruins of my mind. If you hear the voice of a loved one calling for help from outside, do not open the door. The cold learns. "I know you're in there," her voice cried, breaking with a sob that felt like a physical knife in my gut. "I can see the light from the fire under the door. Why won't you let me in? Are you angry at me for coming?" I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hands over my ears, but it was useless. Her voice was inside my head. It was a perfect mimicry, laced with all the shared memories, the private jokes, the deep, unspoken bond of siblings. "Liam, remember when you fell out of the oak tree and broke your arm? You were so scared, and I held your hand all the way to the hospital. Please, Liam, hold my hand now. Just open the door." It was a form of torture so exquisite, so perfectly tailored to me, that I could feel my sanity fraying like an old rope. A part of me, a desperate, loving part, was screaming at me to open the door, that this was real, that my sister was dying on my doorstep while I cowered inside. But the terrified, traumatized survivor knew better. The survivor knew that the thing outside was not my sister. It was a hunger wearing her voice like a costume. I stayed on the floor, rocking back and forth, a low moan escaping my lips. The pleading continued for what felt like an eternity. It begged, it reasoned, it wept. Then, as the hours wore on, the tone began to change. The desperate pleas grew tinged with an ugly, frustrated anger. "Open this door, Liam. Don't you make me stand out here. Open it now." The voice was still Chloe's, but it was stretched thin, distorted by a rage that was utterly alien to her. And then, the true horror began. The voice started to glitch. The perfect imitation began to fail. Underneath the sound of my sister's voice, a second, deeper tone began to emerge. It was a low, guttural resonance, a sound like stone grinding against stone deep underground. Plea, grind, ease, Liam. The two sounds existed at once, a horrific layering of the familiar and the monstrous. My sister's voice was now just a thin veneer, cracking and peeling away to reveal the abomination beneath. The knocking at the door stopped. It was replaced by a heavy, wet thudding, as if a great boneless weight was being thrown against the wood. The voice finally abandoned the pretense of humanity altogether. The last vestiges of my sister's voice were stripped away, and what came from outside was a chorus of horrors. It was the whistling from the first night, the whispers from my memories, and the deep, grinding stone sound all woven together into a cacophony of pure, malevolent intent. It was the sound of a predator, its patience gone, its true nature revealed. I stayed there, a broken thing on the floor, and listened as the monster raged outside my door until the first faint rays of morning light pierced the darkness. And then, as it had every other time, it simply stopped. The silence that fell was not empty. It was filled with the ghost of my sister's voice, a wound that would never heal. I had survived the night, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul that a part of me had died right outside that door. The thing outside my door had fallen silent, but the echo of my sister's corrupted voice was a wound that would never close. I had survived, but survival felt like a curse. Before we discover the truth of what waited for me in the daylight, do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel and comment below. What do you think these creatures are? An ancient spirit? A forgotten god? Your guess is as good as mine was, and I was about to come face to face with its handiwork. Dawn arrived not as a glorious sunrise, but as a slow, reluctant dilution of the darkness. The world outside my windows transitioned from impenetrable black to a bruised violet gray. I remained on the floor for a long time, a marionette with its strings cut, my body a geography of aches, and my mind a hollowed-out cavern. The silence was absolute. I eventually found the strength to crawl to the window, my movements stiff and arthritic, like those of a very old man. I peered outside. The snow was pristine, untouched. There were no tracks, no signs of the violent, hours-long assault. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the entire soul-shattering ordeal had been a dream. But the deep, gouging scratches on the outside of my door and the profound, echoing emptiness inside me were proof that it had been real. I spent the day in a fugue state. I reinforced the fire, my movements automatic. I consumed nothing, my stomach a tight knot of revulsion. I read no more from the journals. I felt that if I saw my grandfather's words, I would shatter completely. I was operating on a single primal instinct: endure. When the sun began its descent, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of blood and fire, a new kind of terror took hold. The previous nights had been a series of tests, of questions. I had the horrifying certainty that the questioning period was over. The cold now knew my defenses. It knew my weaknesses. It knew my love for my sister. And tonight, it would not be asking for permission to enter. The generator kicked on at 6, its familiar hum a pathetic defiance against the encroaching night. I had built the fire into a raging inferno, the hearth glowing with an intensity that made the rest of the cabin feel like a cave. I sat in my armchair, the fire poker clutched in my white-knuckled grip, my eyes fixed on the door. I was a cornered animal, waiting for the predator to make its final move. The attack, when it came, was nothing like I expected. There was no whistling, no knocking, no voices. It began with a sound from the chimney. A low guttural cracking, like 1,000 frozen branches snapping at once. Soot and a puff of frigid air blasted from the fireplace, sending sparks showering into the room. The flames in the hearth, which had been a roaring pillar of heat, suddenly faltered. They seemed to shrink away from the chimney flue, their colors shifting from a healthy orange to a sickly, pale blue, as if being starved of oxygen. And then the cold came. Not the creeping, ambient chill from before. The air in the cabin was not getting colder. It was being replaced. A wave of absolute zero radiated from the fireplace, a tangible presence that sucked the warmth from the room in a single, silent gasp. On the stone hearth, a latticework of frost appeared, spreading outwards with an unnatural speed. It was not the delicate frost of a winter morning. This was a thick, crystalline growth, like alien coral, and it advanced across the floorboards with a faint, crackling hiss. It was coming through the chimney. It had found a way to bypass the door, bypass the walls. A direct, undeniable invasion. I scrambled backward, away from the advancing ice, my breath fogging and freezing in front of my face. The rules had failed. The defenses were broken. My grandfather's fortress had been breached. As the frost consumed the floor, a memory from the journals, a half-read, desperate scrawl, surfaced from the depths of my panicked mind. Should all else fail, should the hearth grow cold and the walls prove false, there is a last resort. Beneath the floorboards, where the earth is deep and the roots of the old pine hold fast, there is a place of refuge, the old root cellar. It will not see you. It will not feel you. It will only feel the cold stone and the deep earth. The cellar. There was a thick bearskin rug in the center of the room. I had assumed it was for warmth. Now, I knew it was for concealment. With a surge of desperate energy, I lunged for the rug, pulling it aside. Underneath was a heavy trapdoor with a simple iron ring. My fingers, numb with the encroaching cold, fumbled with the ring. The frost was only feet away now, its hissing growing louder. I pulled and the heavy door lifted, revealing a square of perfect earthy blackness. A rickety ladder descended into the dark. I threw myself into the hole, not even bothering with the rungs, and landed with a painful thud on a floor of damp, cold soil. I reached up, grabbed the trapdoor, and pulled it shut over my head. And the world disappeared. I was in absolute darkness, the air thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying wood, and faint, sweet scent of potatoes stored a lifetime ago. It was a tomb, a grave, and it was my only hope. Above me, I heard the trapdoor creak as the frost spread over it. Then a new sound, a heavy, catastrophic groan of tortured wood. The front door of the cabin, the one that had held for so long, splintered and burst inward with a sound like a gunshot. It was inside. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locked tight. I was now directly beneath my hunter. I could hear it moving. The sound was not of footsteps. It was a combination of a soft, dragging weight and the incessant, high-pitched crackle of freezing air. It was the sound of a living glacier moving through the cabin. And the voices, oh God, the voices. It wasn't one voice anymore. It was a legion. I could hear the child's whistling, my roommate's joke, my sister's sobs, and the deep, grinding sound from the abyss, all at once. It was a low, whispering drone, a symphony of stolen lives, and it was the sound of utter madness. I pressed myself against the damp earth wall of the cellar, trying to make myself smaller, trying to cease to exist. Something heavy crashed to the floor directly above me. The table, perhaps. I heard the sound of my grandfather's books being scraped from their shelves, the pages freezing and shattering like glass. It was searching, ransacking the last bastion of warmth and life, converting it to its own sterile, frozen domain. The dragging, crackling sound moved, and then it stopped. Directly above the trapdoor, directly above me. The whispering drone of voices ceased. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. I could feel its presence, its immense weight, its absolute cold, separated from me by only a few inches of wood and earth. I felt it was listening, not with ears, but with the cold itself, probing the space around it for any pocket of warmth, any flicker of life. I dared not breathe. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that I was sure it could hear, that it could feel. It remained there for a full minute, an eternity in which my life hung by a single fraying thread. Then, with an agonizing slowness, the dragging sound resumed. It moved away from the cellar door toward the back of the cabin. It stayed there for the remainder of the night, a silent, occupying force. I remained in my earthen tomb, shivering uncontrollably, lost in a darkness that was both literal and absolute. Light. A thin grey line of it appeared at the edge of the trapdoor. Morning. As the sun's rays touched the cabin, I heard a sound like a great slow exhalation, The constant low-level crackling of the frost ceased. The oppressive weight of its presence lifted. It was gone. It took me another hour to summon the courage to move. I pushed open the trapdoor and climbed out into my grandfather's cabin. It was a ruin. Every surface was coated in a thick, melting layer of the unnatural frost. The furniture was overturned, the books destroyed. The front door hung from a single hinge, shattered and broken. The world outside was bright, silent, and indifferent. I was standing amidst the wreckage, a ghost in my own home, when I heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow outside. I spun around, the fire poker still in my hand. Elias stood in the broken doorway. Behind him were the two other men from the general store. They weren't looking at me with shock or concern. They were looking at the damage, their faces grim and pragmatic. One of them was carrying a toolbox. He got in, Elias stated. It wasn't a question. The chimney flue. It's an old weakness. We'll have to reinforce it. I stared at him, my mind unable to form words. He stepped into the cabin, his boots crunching on the melting frost. "You did well," he said, his voice devoid of warmth but holding a sliver of what might have been respect. "You used the cellar. Your grandfather would be satisfied." What is happening?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice a wreck. "What was that thing?" Elias looked at me, his weary, pale eyes holding the weight of a terrible ancient truth. "There is no was, son. There is only is. You've survived the initiation. Now it's time you understood the inheritance." He walked over to the broken door and looked out at the vast, silent forest. "Your grandfather was a great man, but he was a proud one. He didn't come here and build a town. He came here and found something sleeping, something ancient and hungry. He woke it up, and when he realized it couldn't be killed, he did the only thing he could. He turned to face me, his expression as bleak as the winter landscape. He didn't run from it. He trapped it. He built a cage. The first cabins, the layout of the town, the routines we follow. It's all part of the containment, a series of locks and wards written in logs and stone and human lives. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of such profound, hopeless horror that I felt my knees weaken. This town, it's not a sanctuary, I breathed. "No," Elias said, shaking his head. "It's a prison, and the cold is the inmate, and we are the wardens." He gestured around the wrecked cabin. "These attacks, the testing, it does this with every new arrival. It's looking for a weak link, a way to break the containment. Your grandfather established the rules as our primary defense. As long as we follow them, the cage holds. The entity is bound to the valley, to the perimeter of the town, but it never ever stops trying to get out." The truth was a sentence, delivered without mercy. I wasn't just visiting. I hadn't just inherited a piece of property. I had inherited a duty, a life sentence. "There's no leaving, is there?" I asked, the question a hollow formality. Elias's gaze was unwavering. "You don't leave Solitude's Point, Liam. You serve your turn. You keep the fire lit and the rules followed, and when you're too old or too tired, or when the night finally breaks you, you send a letter to your next of kin. You tell them they have an inheritance waiting for them in the far north. You pass on the key. You get relieved. This is your grandfather's legacy. It is his burden, and now it is yours. The story ends here, but my life did not. I am writing this a year later. The other men helped me repair the cabin. We reinforced the chimney flue with stone and iron. Life fell into a grim routine. By day we chop wood, we maintain the generators, we survive. By night, we lock our doors, we feed our fires, and we listen to the whispers of the prisoner rattling the bars of its cage. I am a warden. I am a part of the system. I see the same weariness in my own reflection that I first saw in Elias's eyes. Sometimes when a supply plane flies overhead, I look up and feel a phantom ache for a world I can never return to. I am bound to this place, to this duty, until the day I can no longer bear it. And I am forced to write a letter of my own, luring another soul to this cold, forgotten place to take my post. I keep the rules on the table beside me, their plastic laminate now cracked and worn from my own trembling hands. They are my shield. They are my scripture. They are my curse. The sun is setting now, painting the snow in shades of blood and violet. The night is coming, it always is, and now I am its keeper.